Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Gritty Hour. I'm here today with a special guest, but before I introduce him, I want to introduce you to my partner in crime, Rich Del Valle, who's here to co-host today's podcast with me because he knows a hell of a lot more about the subject we're going to cover than I do. I'm a baseball guy. Rich is a football guy. Does that make you an expert, Rich?
Yeah, that makes me an expert.
Well, thanks for coming on. And we do have a special guest today. We have Kevin Bryant, who wrote a book called Spies on the Sidelines, The High-Stakes World of NFL Espionage. And we're going to learn more about that. It sounds like a very intriguing topic. So welcome to the Gritty Hour, Kevin. It's good to have you on board, sir.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate you having me here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And I know you have a military background, and I'd like you maybe to tell the folks broad strokes what that was and how you transitioned into writing the book.
Yep, absolutely. So I spent 8 years in the Army, and at which point I hopped out and became a Army civilian, which I still am, still doing that. I was living over in Germany at the time when I got inspired to write this book. Spygate 2 had just taken place, which was when the Patriots offensive coordinator, Josh McDaniels, transitioned over to the Broncos to become their head coach.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought with him a videographer that had formerly worked for the Patriots during the Spygate era. And that videographer he ended up taping a practice of an opponent for the Broncos, at which point the Broncos organization found out about it and informed the NFL, and the videographer, Josh McDaniels, and the Broncos all were punished as a result of that.
Wow.
So as a Broncos fan, I got very interested in, I just wondered how much spying activity went on in the NFL. And I was working on a master's degree in intelligence studies at the time, and I was about to finish using the rest of my GI Bill on a second master's degree in sports management. And I thought, I've been wanting to write a book for a long time. I've got all this experience. I've got, at the time I had right around 20 years of experience collecting and defending information for the Department of Defense. And I thought this topic suits my background. And I did a bunch of research, realized no one had ever written a comprehensive book that dealt with spying throughout the NFL, going into all the topics, going throughout the whole history of the league, and sharing stories about what's been done with all the various teams that are out there. And so I saw this as my opportunity to finally write and publish a book. And after 8 years, it worked out.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your service to the country. We appreciate it. So tell us a little bit about what the book is about.
So it's called Spies on the Sidelines, The High-Stakes World of NFL Espionage. And it is all about the collection techniques that NFL teams use to gather information on their opponents in order to try to gain a game day advantage. It also goes into the counter techniques that teams use to defend against all the techniques. And it covers the entire history of the NFL, and it's got stories from every single NFL team.
Are some things like things the home, someone sitting at home watching a ball game on the TV could pick up on, or is this all like pre-game stuff that they do?
So for the most part, it's pre-game, and it's during the game that all this stuff takes place. So we're talking about everything from spying on practices, live scouting, or advanced scouting. Film study is a big part of that. Debriefing players and coaches when they switch teams, listening devices, lip reading, and then they cover everything that goes on with the draft, how teams collect on draft prospects, how teams collect on
Sorry, Kevin, I think you froze up for a second, but is the government shutting you down, my friend?
It's the NFL. It's the
Might be
NFL.
Robert Kraft.
Actually, while you were frozen, Rich had a question he wanted to ask you.
Yeah. So how big per team? How big is this? I don't even know what you don't call it a scout team because you obviously have the video that gets done before games that a whole team collects, but how much more goes on in addition to that?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit. I mean, film study and advanced scouting as a whole is without a doubt the majority of collection activity that every team is doing on the other. Um, so having said that, advanced scouting is not just watching film. It can be, the live scouting still very important because you want to try to pick up on the other team's signals, the hand signals at the line of
Right.
scrimmage. Obviously today, and you also get into package signals, which is so when the players take the field and substitutes come off and new players come on, that is all done via what's called a package signal. And that being able to identify that is really important because let's say the offense is about to go into the run heavy formation. They're bringing in a bunch of big guys to run the ball. Well, if the defense can see that signal called early enough, they can make sure that they get the right players on the field to be able to line up against that. And sometimes it's pretty obvious what's about to come. It's a 3rd and short. Okay, yeah, they're
Right.
bringing on,
You're gonna run.
they're bringing on their big guys. That's they're probably going to run the ball, no surprise. But at other times, it can kind of tip. It can tip the hand, and a team can say, hey, ooh, they're bringing they're bringing in their pass catching tight end and all this, and so it can be very handy and give them a few extra seconds of preparation time to figure out an appropriate defense for that. But then you've got stuff like studying studying what's out there with the media, what's out there with the radio, newspaper, TV, because a lot of times, teams are giving away information, whether, on purpose or accidental, and
Right.
being able to scan through all of that to figure out, for instance, if an injured player is going to play on Sunday or not can be a big advantage, especially if it's a key player, if you can figure that out ahead of time. And sometimes that's leaked out through the media. And then sometimes coaches purposefully put out false information. And so, that comes with all this. And teams have to be able to try to sort through that and figure out what's real versus what's fake.
Like a false flag saying this guy strained his ankle to throw the other team off. Meanwhile, the guy's fine.
Right. Pretty
Right.
much.
So yeah. I mean, all of it goes on in the NFL. It's a big game of cat and mouse of trying to fool the other opponent and gain any little tiny advantage you can, because the NFL is built around parity, right? All these teams
Right.
are designed the way the draft is designed, the way the salary cap structure is designed, is to make all these teams as equal as can be, and to
Right.
make the games as competitive as possible. And so, especially nowadays, when games are coming down to 3 to 7 points all the time, it's really important for them to try to get any little advantage that they can.
Well, then,
So
I'm sorry, Rich, go ahead.
so how does you mentioned the point spreads. How does Vegas handle this? I mean, Vegas, do they think it's an unfair advantage? Are they getting more information maybe than the other team is?
Well, I mean, I would say it's something that's probably indirectly calculated when they're taking this into consideration. You play like a team like the Patriots. The Patriots have won a lot of games where they didn't have necessarily the best team on the field, but they still won the game. When it came to the Rams Patriots Super Bowl, for instance, that Rams team was like first in the NFL in offense. It was third in the NFL on defense. And the Patriots were, they were middle of the pack on both offensive and defensively that year. So and yet they still won. Because they do the little things better. And frankly, one of the things that came out that year was that that we later learned was that the Patriots had a staff member who watched the entire walkthrough practice that the Rams had, and that keyed them off on some very important key information. So, nowadays I would think that the bets makers, the odds makers know that, what's going to be up to something. He always is, and are going to take that in consideration when determining the betting lines.
Well, how much of this would be considered advanced scouting, and how much of this would be considered cheating?
So there's a lot of both. I mean, advanced scouting is probably like you're going to get roughly probably 75% of your information from that. And your 15% you're going to try to fill in versus these other techniques that are permissible, such as going through, seeing what's out there on the media, debriefing players. Maybe you had a player that played for your opponent last year, and you can talk to them, or that was recently cut and you picked up. And sometimes teams pick up these players on purpose just to be able to talk to them and say, hey, what do these signals mean?
Right.
What is the quarterback, what are his strengths? What are his weaknesses? So all this type of stuff, they're gonna try to learn as much as they can about the opponent through these means that are absolutely permissible and allowed. And then there's 10% of the game that it changes from week to week. So like an offense, they'll stick with 90% of their game plan week in and week out. But that 10% change, teams want to know what's going to happen. And the only way to typically be able to get that type of information is to use either controversial or illicit means to collect it, such as spying on practices, such as using listening devices, or lip reading. So yeah, there's a lot that, it's that 10% that sounds like it's really small, but when you're talking about being able to identify and know what's going to happen for things that have never been used in a game before, that becomes very, very important, very critical if you can do that.
Hmm. Where are you located, Kevin? I'm sorry, Rich. Where are you located? In Washington?
No, so I'm just outside of Atlanta.
Oh, Atlanta. Okay. And Rich had a question, but before he does, I'm gonna, if with your permission, Kevin, I'd like to show the folks the website that you have for the book. So you can
Absolutely, please.
go ahead and ask Rich, and I'll just show Kevin's website here.
So Kevin, in talking about, Tom mentioned cheating versus whatever else you might want to call it. Now that we come into the radio helmets, where the play comes in, how much of that is getting intercepted? I mean, there's got to be, I was watching the baseball game yesterday, and Max Scherzer was talking about how he'd rather get signals because, stealing signs is part of the game, but is getting plays ahead of it get part of the game?
Yes, it is. It is. And it used to be by stealing signals before headsets came into play, and there was about a decade between offenses could talk to the quarterback, about a decade before the defensive coordinator could talk to a defensive player. So so there was that big gap that still allowed teams to collect defensive signals, which is what the Patriots ultimately got in trouble for with Spygate.
Right.
But now that you've got headsets, really the only things that teams can steal via signals are package signals or audible hand shown audibles. But yes, so headset tampering, that is something that the Patriots have been accused of doing. And not just, and there have been problems at many other stadiums throughout the NFL. I think it's probably unrealistic to think that if the Patriots are doing it, that they're the only ones involved. It's something I go into in my book. I think it's a very interesting subject. If the Patriots, there's a lot of very technical explanations for how it could be done. Because what's used today are those headsets have military level encryption. It's to think that a team it has that level of capacity to be able to break those is probably not realistic. However, I've got a theory on how it could be done that is much simpler, and it is in the book. And I think if it is done, I think it's very realistic. So I'm not going to give that one away. I think check the book out because it's not out there anywhere else, and I think it's pretty. I think people are going to look at that and go, oh, yeah, that's how it would be done. Yeah.
Well, I spoke to a few of my friends that I'd be interviewing you this evening, and they all asked me to ask you about Deflategate and what your input is on that.
Yeah. So I've got a chapter in the book on Deflategate.
Okay.
And I mean, Deflategate's really interesting because, it looks pretty clear cut that, well, I mean, the individual that was allegedly responsible for deflating the footballs inside of a bathroom and taking them out of the referee's locker room without the referee's permission. It looked, I mean, there was video. He said the person who allegedly did this action said that, hey, I took the footballs, I went straight out onto the field. Well, the NFL found videotape, and it clearly showed that was not the case. He stopped in a bathroom before. A company which did the investigation said that, yes, that was enough time to deflate the footballs. We know the footballs were deflated. I think the interesting portion came out when a professor at MIT did some research and then found out during the course of the game that the footballs could have been deflated by the amount that the PSI that was lost in the Patriots footballs.
And it wasn't a lot. It wasn't a lot of PSI.
It was like a pound. It was like a pound per football, roughly, I think, off the top of my head. So, but the thing is, their opponents' footballs though did not lose the same amount of PSI, lost much less. So right. It gets interesting there. And of course, then there's the whole battle with Tom Brady and Robert Kraft versus Roger Goodell in the NFL, which almost went to the Supreme Court. Which is just like we've got no bigger problems to tackle than whether a football lost a pound or so. So it was a big mess. But the thing in the end that was very interesting, I think, was the punishment that was put on, which was fairly heavy, and even heavier, I think, than Spygate punishment in a lot of ways. And that's one of the things I talk in the book is about how the NFL's reaction to Spygate and what Bill Belichick told Roger Goodell. Allegedly he said he was going to issue an apology, and then Belichick never did that. And that and so ostensibly that kind of ticked off everybody at the NFL, including Goodell. So when they had the chance to properly punish them, they did. I mean, the punishment was definitely heavier. But the one thing I go into my book is the Patriots. I don't think they're ever going to stop this type of thing until the NFL makes the punishment heavy enough that it's worth it. Right. It's like a holding call. Teams are going to hold or cheat however they want until the punishment becomes, till it's enforced often enough and the punishment is heavy enough for it to mean something. And until that takes place, guess what? Teams are just, the Patriots are just they're gonna keep doing this stuff. And it's amazing how many different types of questionable to illicit activities they've either done or been alleged to have been involved with. And I go into all of that with the book, and it goes into a lot of different things. And headset tampering is one of them. Stealing play sheets out of locker rooms is another. So, yeah.
Well, if you read the sample passage on your website, it's unbelievable the amount of stuff to do. Oh, it makes me curious. How big are the staffs for these so-called scouts? Like, there's got to be 100 guys per team just doing this kind of stuff.
Well, there aren't. And so you've got, this is the interesting thing. You've got some teams that have a very professional and organized collection capacity. And then you have other teams that are using, coaches, assistants, interns to do this. So for instance, when it comes to like collecting on, see what's out there in the media. Very often it's just like, hey, intern, go see what, go check up on the Steelers this week and see what news, if anything's of importance that you can find out. And they may hand them, 4 or 5 topics that they're interested in knowing about. But for the most part, it's not someone who's trying to do this. It's not someone who has a background in it, or even knows what sites to go visit, or that knows how to properly diagnose this, or that knows, hey, the other team, the other coach may be trying to fool us and put out false information. And what's the level of deception that is typical with this coach? Some teams know that and some teams don't. And it's so, even if you collect on it, can you believe what you have?
Right.
And some coaches probably get suckered in by that. And some coaches, they'll collect it, but they'll say, but we can't use it because we don't know, which isn't professional either, because you need to know. So there's a huge, band of difference between all these teams and how sophisticated they are in doing this. And the teams that are competing for Super Bowls, they do this stuff. They do the little things well. And these are some of the little things that are involved.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the Detroit Lions don't do it very well.
There are I won't name names when it comes to teams, but I will say there are a number of teams that are less frequently mentioned in my book than others. And the teams that I notice have a scarcity of stories in here are typically the teams that are not making the playoffs year in and year out.
Is it because they don't want to spend the money to do it, or they just maybe feel that it's not the right thing to do?
Well, it does cost money. There's no doubt about that. Sure. So it can come down to budget. It can come down to what owner you have. Are they willing to spend freely to get every single type of advantage that you can possibly have? It can come down to the coach. How comfortable does he feel pushing the envelope? And a lot don't. A lot they want to color within the lines, and there's a lot to be said that is good about that. But when you look back at coaches that are winning the Super Bowl, a lot of times you find that these are the guys that are pushing the envelope when it comes to collecting on opponents. You've got guys like, so Belichick, right? Big one. Al Davis, Mike Shanahan, Sid Gillman back with the Chargers, George Halas with the Bears. These are all guys that have been willing to push that envelope a little bit, and they're winning big games because of this.
So you're going from the coach down. You're not really saying anything about ownership. Do you think Jerry Jones gets involved? Do you think Mr. Blank gets involved where you are?
So yeah, there are absolutely stories in my book where I can show you where collection, an illicit, not permitted collection techniques such as spying on practices were directly from an owner. So yes, it does take place. As a matter of fact, one owner told a low-level assistant who got tagged to go spy on an opponent. Hey, if the NFL catches you, it's okay. You know, you may get fired and kicked out of the NFL, but I'll give you a job, you know, outside of the NFL. So, you know, don't worry about it, you know. So yeah, absolutely. You know, it takes place at all levels. And I think a good example of that is Spygate. So, you know, Robert Kraft, what happens to Belichick after Spygate? Well, you know, Belichick's not up for his contract's not up for a whole nother season.
Right.
But right after, I mean, like a week or two after Spygate, he gets an extension and a huge raise. So, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, an owner says, you know, to the public, to the NFL, oh, we're so sorry, you know, this was terrible, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, hey, Belichick, you're winning me Super Bowls. And as long as you're winning me Super Bowls,
That's all I care.
you know, I'm going to take care of you.
Right.
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 Well, Rich's questions, the last two questions, reminded me to ask you, how much input from anybody that works in the NFL in any capacity did you procure for this book, if any?
Yeah. So, yes, I did have some interviews, and for the most part, well, everything I believe was anonymous because of the sensitivity of the topic. I've since spoken with quite a few that have either mostly former coaches that have worked in the NFL. So yeah, I did get some, but the bottom line is, you know, it's really hard to interview people on this topic because you're talking about, you know, if they're currently involved with the NFL, they don't want to give away any trade secrets, even if it's for permissible collection techniques. They don't want to tell how their team does it because it can, you know, it can provide them advantages if they do it better than everybody else.
Right.
And obviously, they don't want to talk about illicit collection techniques because they could potentially get in trouble with the league. They could taint the legacies of individuals, or even cost somebody their job. So yeah, it is very difficult. The majority of the information that I got for this book was either found in articles that were published on the internet, or through books that were, for the most part, written by former coaches. And that's where the vast majority of the information came from, was sucking out stories from those books, and you know, sometimes just a paragraph or a page or two that was relevant, and sticking them in my book. God, it was ridiculously hard to find them all and compile them all and get enough information to be able to make this thing. That's why it took me 8 years, but yeah, but at last we're here.
Do you think that this thing rolls into the big time college level?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. So as a matter of fact, most of the collection techniques, or at least a good number of them, were around in college football before the pros, right? So college football, you know, goes back to the 1880s, right. And you're talking about, you know, spying on practices, advanced scouting, debriefing players. This stuff was all being done in college football long before pro. And in some of the techniques there were even more outrageous, such as, you know, sending members of your coaching staff, especially younger guys, and having them go try out for the other team. And then, you know, at the end of preseason, they'd come back and, you know, sometimes be spotted on the sidelines of the other team and be like, hey, didn't that guy try out for a team? You know? So it's absolutely wild what goes on in college ball. And you want to talk about like all the recruiting stuff, just, oh my goodness.
That's a whole other mess.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, so there's some big time collection activities that go on with those big college football programs.
You mentioned the use of a priest in the book.
Yeah.
How did he get involved?
So there are a couple times when priests were suspected of spying for Al Davis while with the Raiders. There's another really, there's another good story in there about. So before a championship game between the Raiders and Chiefs, back when Al Davis was the coach of the Raiders, I don't know if he was coach or the owner at the time, but it was Al Davis's Raiders, and Hank Stram was the coach of the Chiefs. A couple was sitting at a restaurant, and the Raiders quarterback, I believe, was Daryl LaMonica at the time, and another player were sitting there, and the quarterback was drawing out diagrams. And when they left on a table mat, on a paper, tablecloth or whatever, and when they were done, the couple, which were KC fans, grabbed the table mat and called up Hank Stram at his hotel and said, "Hey, I've got something for you." And in his hotel room at the time was Monsignor Mackey, member of the a Catholic Monsignor. Yep. And Monsignor Mackey said to Hank Stram, "Hey, this could, I don't know if you should trust it. This could be they were wondering if this could be a setup from Al Davis, if he was trying to get him in trouble with the league." So, Hank Stram said, "Yeah, you're right. I shouldn't be the one to take it. How about you do it?" And so Monsignor Mackey gets suckered in, and he's the one who accepts this play sheet from him and does this clandestine exchange to be able to get this information and all this type of stuff. So
and the Chiefs made a nice donation to the church.
right. So it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing who all gets involved in this stuff. I mean, the battle in the AFL and the NFL, they used to use what they call babysitters, guys who, like, wealthy businessmen who would help recruit the best talent to whichever, to both leagues, the AFL or the NFL. And, one of them was the former governor of Oregon. It was one of those guys. So, it just goes to show you, man. I mean, people are tapping into everything, whether it's, the clergy, whether it's a governor of a state. It's wild.
It's almost like warfare. I mean, comes back to full circle to what you've been doing for the country.
Well, I mean, I think, as a fan of a team, I think anybody who's out there would be like, "Oh man, I'd love to be able to help my team win a game," right? And these are just instances where, some fans of teams had the opportunity to be able to assist, and sometimes they're in some unusual positions, and but they're just they're excited to help the team out just like everybody else.
Well, Kevin, I know the book's only been out 10 days, maybe a week and a half. Have you had any feedback? I see the review from Cam Cameron here. Have you had any feedback from anybody in the NFL since the book's been released?
I have. So yeah, I've got Cam Cameron up there, who is a former Dolphins head coach. Mike Barilla, who is a former Eagles Pro Bowl quarterback, was kind enough to provide another review. And so I've connected with a lot of former NFL players and coaches on LinkedIn and whatnot. So I've got quite a few reading the book now. So as it all trickles in, I'll post anything I get up here and whatnot. So I'm hoping to, of course, get some more reviews from those guys doing that stuff and hearing feedback from them and what they think of the book and hearing their stories. So
nothing from the league itself, or are you just not answering that phone call?
I've just had my cell phone switched off ever since the book's been released, and plan to keep it that way for the next couple of years. So
there you go. Well, I'm really interested. Do you have any interest in baseball? Are you a baseball fan?
I used to watch quite a bit of college baseball, so I think I know where you're going with this, with all that. I mean, obviously there's a lot of
already.
Yeah, there's
It's
a lot
all,
of spying that
it's,
goes on in baseball. There
yeah, it's
sure
all
is.
in Manhattan anyway.
No,
Yeah.
to be honest, when you were talking about the techniques some teams use against one another, I was thinking of the cheating scandal in baseball a few years ago. Rich will remember better than me. Was it the Houston Astros that got
The
nailed?
Astros, yeah, with the signs. Yeah. Yeah. When
So
they were banging the drums.
this occurs in. So, but I
No,
can.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to, where we started with that, the electronics. I just think that that's going to be a bigger problem because, and I know what you're saying, Kevin, about having sophisticated equipment to steal, but it can be done. I'm sure it can be done.
Yeah.
I mean, you go overseas
Absolutely.
with a cell phone, and the other country is basically taking your cell phone calls, and they know everything you're saying.
I think Kevin would know more than all
Yeah.
of us about how it can be done, right, Kevin? But obviously, I see.
I won't confirm or deny anything, but what what I will say is that when it comes to the evolution of technology, that does play a big role in how teams collect. It used to be back in the day that teams were very worried about airplanes and helicopters flying over practices. And sometimes teams would shut down the practices while they were flying overhead. And as a matter of fact, some coaches would use binoculars and try to have, their assistants read the registration number of planes and then call up the FAA and say, hey, Bob, who does this plane belong to? I think they were spying on us, So, but nowadays, right, the threats to drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. And obviously, the threat, like with playbooks in the past, used to be that playbooks would be physically stolen. The worry today is that playbooks will be electronically stolen. And then, you have listening devices that keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller in different ways to be able to access all of that, which is a very, very real threat to teams. So, yeah, absolutely. That becomes and it is an increasing worry to teams, and it gets more and more complicated, and thus the need for, better equipment, but better trained or professionals that know how to deal with these threats as well.
Is there a set team for that, like counter intelligence or defense, I guess you would call it?
Yeah, so what I see for the most part is that every team has a security specialist, which is typically a former FBI guy, who knows a bit about, securing information, all of this. Of course, every team has an IT staff, which is going to work on securing their information, such as, their computers and tablets where playbooks are kept.
Right.
But if you're talking about a true, counterintelligence professional, no. Teams are not going to have that level of complexity on average on their team. So now, having said that, teams will absolutely call in experts from time to time. So if they feel that, let's say, a listening device, they're worried about a listening device in their team headquarters or in, the visiting team's locker room where they're going to play, they will go to a private company and pay to have them come and do a sweep of that area to ensure that is, free of listening devices. That absolutely goes on. Or if there's an investigation where they're worried about something, they're like, hey, we think we've got a problem here and we need either, more people or just people with more expertise in whatever particular field it is, whether it's countering a drone threat, whether it's dealing with listening devices, or whether they think they have a spy inside of their own organization. Then yeah, they pick up the phone and they call private companies that specialize in all of that.
Right.
What would trigger that kind of a concern? Like something where the other teams 1 week seemed like they knew in advance what the play was going to be? That kind of thing would raise the suspicion?
Yeah, and so there's so many possibilities, right? So let's say a team seems to, just like you said, seems to know what's going to take place. And it's never, it's plays that have never been used before. So obviously they're compromised somehow. The problem is finding out how. So did they find that information through spying on a practice? Was there a leak in the media somewhere where that information got out? Is there an insider threat on the team? Do you have a former player that maybe has access to the field still, to watch practices, that's hurting for money, and is potentially passing on some information to another team? There's so many different ways that information could potentially get out, or maybe it's the playbook. Maybe electronically a playbook's compromised, or film is compromised, or whatever. It can be really hard to narrow down all of that. So, when they need help figuring out all that type of stuff, or just figuring out, hey, we may never know how this happened, but how can we prevent it in the future? And then a professional company can come in and say, hey, I've done this assessment. Here are your vulnerabilities that I see. And these are the recommendations that I have to be able to fix those, so that you won't have to, that hopefully you won't have this problem again in the future.
Mm. To Rich's point earlier, I would think the bookmakers in Vegas have to be doing something similar for every team to get an edge on, how to make them odds and each week, and as it progresses into the playoffs and the Super Bowl, etc. They have to have teams of guys doing some sort of surveillance. And I'm wondering, do teams counter surveil that, or do they care as long as it's not another NFL team? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So betting is a very big concern of the NFL at large. As a matter of fact, NFL has a group called NFL Security, which are comprised of mainly former FBI guys, mainly former high-ranking FBI officials, and their job, above everything else, is to ensure that games are not thrown and the point spread is not manipulated. That's one of their biggest concerns.
Right.
So yes, the NFL is very very active in trying to ensure that all things Vegas don't come into play in the NFL, and start affecting the games. So having said that, yes, that if you don't think Vegas and the bet, the odds makers are looking into all this stuff, then I think that's a little naive. The reason that teams have to announce injured players now, ahead of time, during the leading up to a game, is because of a big scandal that took place because of the odds that were changed before a game when the media revealed that a player was injured, and the NFL thought they may have a whole big issue of a game being thrown, and it ended up, no, it was just the media learned that a player was injured, and odds makers found out about it, but ever after that they realized the problem was the perception was already out there that the game could be fixed.
Right.
NFL does not want that perception, so they do everything in their power to ensure that is not the case.
Mm-hmm. But that's the league itself does that instead of each individual team.
That is correct. So there is a NFL security member assigned to every NFL team as well.
I see.
And in addition to dealing with a variety of other topics that they help each team with, which is in general, keeping the player safe, making sure players aren't involved in, stupid activities like drug or gang activity, that would potentially tarnish the league's reputation, right? And if they are involved with this, how can they deal with it quietly? Because the NFL has a lot of pull. So when they go to the local police force and say, hey, can we please deal with this quietly without, dealing with, every local newspaper around here, they've got a little pool to be able to do that.
Well, I would think, it would be in their best interest to keep it under the rug, yeah.
Right. And having a former FBI official to be able to interact with the police on their behalf is very helpful for all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. The website that we've been showing during Kevin talking about the book is called spiesonthesidelines.com. And as I mentioned before, the book's only been out, when did it come out? Around
13?
August?
Yep,
Excuse
13
me,
July.
week of July. Yeah. So you can find it. You can actually order it right from his website, spiesonthesidelines.com. There'll be a link to it in the show notes. Is it on? It's on Amazon too. I think I saw it on Amazon. There's a lot of nice reviews on there as well.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So,
thanks. Yeah, it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, Walmart, and then quite a few other places that I've got listed there. And it's out in hardback and ebook right now, and in the next month, the audiobook will be coming out as well.
awesome. Who's going to do the vocals for that?
My dad did the vocals for that. He has been helping me all the while with this book, a tremendous, tremendous help. And frankly, I just didn't have the time to make the audiobook and try to market this thing at the same time.
Mm. I just wanted to interject one thing I've learned doing a couple of podcasts with a few folks who've written books. You can ask if you have an independent bookseller in your town. Go in there and ask for the book, and they'll order it for you. And if you don't see the book in your local bookstore, go in there and say, "I'd like to see this book here in the store," and that'll be good as well. So we appreciate your time tonight, Kevin. It was very interesting. My mind is a little boggled with all the stuff that's going on, but it is a high stakes business. I mean, it's a business, and when the rubber meets the road, that's what it is, a business. So you kind of expect that kind of stuff to go on. But you certainly have the background to know. Yeah, I think your background, now that you've explained the book to me, your background is perfect for writing this kind of a book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it fit really well. It was a good fit, and I think that's I'd wanted to write a book for a long time, but trying to figure out what subject matter to write on is always every author's biggest challenge. So I felt very lucky to have been able to figure this one out and kind of fill a niche that no one had filled before.
Well, now that you've dived headfirst into the book publishing world, do you have one in the works, or you just?
I do. Book 2 is on the same topic, but college football.
Yes.
And so book 3 is going to be baseball, isn't it?
The first book took me 8 years to write, so I'm only looking one book ahead.
Well, I think you did a phenomenal job with your first book, and I urge all of our listeners and viewers to
Yeah.
Amazon.com is where I would go and buy the book.
Yeah.
Maybe wait for his pops to come out with the audio book if you're too lazy to read. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. It's been a very interesting hour, and I enjoyed it immensely. And I want to thank also Rich for co-hosting as you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Kevin. Thanks for your service. We appreciate that.
Yes, thank you again for your service.
Absolutely, my honor. Thanks for having me on, Tom. Appreciate it.
Hopefully we'll see you further on up the road, and good luck.
Absolutely.
To the book, and that's Spies on the Sidelines: The High Stakes World of NFL Espionage. Thanks again, sir. Have a great evening.
All right, you too.